Medieval times. Ye olde England. This is the most popular setting for fantasy novels, and I'm not necessarily down on that. I could probably make a whole video of reasons why the medieval England, medieval Europe setting is so popular and why it works, but that is not the focus of this video. This video is about how to make your fantasy world not be medieval England or Europe, or for that matter, like anywhere else. How to make a fantasy world that feels like its own unique place. My name is Lydia Foxglove, and I am a fantasy author. I've been writing about the same fantasy world for 30 years, and I didn't consciously set out to create a world that felt like a unique place. It's just how it shook out over time. And I'm not saying that I have like the best world building ever or anything, but I do think that if you want to create a world that feels like it has its own culture, that I have succeeded in that decently well. So I feel like I have some advice for achieving that vibe. And it's not necessarily an easy thing to do consciously. You are creating an entire world, which is a big job. You don't want to alienate your readers either. You don't want to throw so many unique things at them that they get overwhelmed or confused. But it is a wonderful feeling to be reading a book and feel a little surprised, like, wow, I've never encountered anything quite like this before. What an interesting world. So in some ways, the best way to create a unique fantasy world might be to work on it for your entire life in an unconscious way with the innocence of a child. But let's suppose that you're already an adult, too late for that. You don't have 30 years to come up with a fantasy world. How would you do it in a condensed time frame? I'm going to try my best to analyze that question. Number one, this might not help you. If you just sat down, like, I want to make a unique fantasy world and I want to do it all today, but read nonfiction. Read lots of nonfiction on all kinds of different places and time frames and cultures. The more you have banked in your brain to pull from in an organic way, the more it will just naturally work its way in. And you'll also have that sense of like how worlds operate, how one thing leads to another, what having a river nearby does, what the invention of this thing does. It's going to enter your fantasy world naturally, whereas if you are a fantasy author who only reads other fantasy novels, then that's going to be reflected probably in using a lot of common fantasy world settings. My favorite thing in the whole world is like sociological history, and I also love reading about other places. I just like reading about how people live, what makes us different, what makes us the same, what consequences different changes have on human nature. So that gives me a lot to pull from. But it is harder to delve into certain cultures than others. If you go to the library or your local bookstore right now, you're probably going to see a section on England that's like this big, and the section on Africa is going to be like this big. So even if you want a diverse world, it definitely is a little harder to achieve it, at least in a way that feels really knowledgeable and comes from a really organic place from a lot of different influences, which is unfortunate. Hopefully this continues to change, but it does tend to be that books are published in response to places people want to travel or places that are in the news. So to get a lot of books on certain countries is probably going to require one of those few things to happen. Still, I try to read as much as I can about as many places and as many cultures as I can. You can definitely see in my world that there's still more influence from Europe and Asia than anywhere else, and I've been trying to work in a little more diversity, but I want it to feel organic and not just something that I slapped on. So that's a tricky balance. I want my fantasy world to feel like it's its own culture, not quite like anything you've seen before. Most of the action takes place on one continent, but even one continent has a ton of cultural diversity, and I also want to give the sense that there are other places and other cultures, that this is a full planet with hundreds of cultures, which is very ambitious to say the least. And with that said, I'm going to go in an unexpected direction perhaps and say, number 2 advice: don't get fancy with the names. This might sound counterintuitive, but I think it helps if you don't want to give off a vibe of any particular place to just make the names be fantasy names. Because if you try to have a lot of linguistic diversity, inevitably you're going to start riffing off of sounds that feel familiar. You've probably seen fantasy novels that have like the Middle Eastern people, and you know it right away because their names sound Middle Eastern. And then as soon as you hear that Middle Eastern name, you expect there to be like a desert and desert culture, bazaars with merchants hawking rugs. And since I don't want to have a fantasy Middle East, I just decided to keep all the names in the realms of traditional fantasy names. Everybody in the main series is speaking some dialect of the same language. I have a few vague hand-wavy reasons why that might be true. Logistically, the main reason is just so that I have this one coherent language and the names are pulled from this coherent language. There's a lot of repeated patterns in the language and the names that you'll see pop up, and if you were really paying attention, you would start to see meanings in them, like door relates to death, Mir relates to the moon, rune means hand, Wodrin means fate, and any ear sound relates to crystals, which are called Irin. And if you're getting a bit of a Tolkien vibe from these sounds, so I have names like Dormangara, Dorathan, Mirali, Varavissa, terms like the Wodrina rune, the Hand of Fate, and Sanarune, the bodyguards to the wealthy merchant families. And if you're getting a very vague Tolkien vibe from this, like Minas Tirith and Mordor, you're on the right track. It's not on accident. That way, no matter what, your first thought is, oh, this is a fantasy world. Of course, there is a Western bias in this, and if you were trying to write like an Asian fantasy world, you wouldn't do that. But this is one case where I purposefully wanted to harness the Western bias because I have English speakers, and I don't want the names to give them a preconception of what kind of country we're dealing with here. From there, my third tip is to draw from many different countries, different cultures, and avoid specifics. One of the main characters of my Cursed Soul trilogy is Grau Thano. His name gives off a little bit of a German or French vibe. He has straight black hair, light brown skin. His eyes are described in as much of an Asian way as I can get away with without saying he looks Asian, which is, it's surprisingly difficult to describe Asian eyes in a fantasy world when you can't just like signal that someone is Asian. Because if you look this up online, there's a lot of debate as to how to describe an Asian eye without it sounding kind of racist. So this is an eternal struggle, but anyway, basically he looks rather Asian. I could see him on like the steppes of Mongolia. His clothes also read a little like Chinese maybe, but I don't describe them in like specific detail, so they could be from a few different places. There are certainly times in European history that would fit the same description of his clothes. And he's not from the steppes, he's from this cool misty marshland, which is a big part of like his identity, at least in my mind. And I'm not even really sure where or who you think of when you think of a cool misty marsh. One of the first things he does in the book is take Velsa to a bakery that sounds very European, but on the other hand, his favorite food is rice, and he always wants rice throughout 4 books. I think there's not a one that goes by without a mention of Grau wanting rice. So he probably reads a little more Asian than Western, but I didn't want to make it obvious because in my mind, he's really not either of those things. He's from the marsh near Marnow, which is why when I'm describing him, he might eat rice, but he's never like buying a bottle of sriracha. His clothes may read somewhat Chinese, but I never describe them in really specific terms that would give you that impression. Some people might read it and again see more of like a medieval tunic. No one in the world is ever going to eat sauerkraut, but they might eat pickled cabbage. So I try to avoid any words that really are associated with one country or one little region. And then it's fun to invent slightly new things, slightly new foods, different customs. And the Broken Queen, Tashia and Atora go to something called the Duet Theater, which has a male and female singer singing a series of love songs that tell a story. It's kind of like an opera, and it's kind of like a idol concert. So it's mixing a few things, and it becomes the culture of their particular country. Tip number 4. This is one that I did start to do very consciously over the years when I was kind of sorting out all of the elements of my world and deciding like what to keep, how to clean it up from like my childhood mess is to think about what you really like in a world. What do you find the most interesting? What do you find the most delightful? What are you drawn to in cultures around the world, and work those things in, because it's your world. Why not make it a place that you would enjoy being? Clearly, I like Japanese pop culture. I like how everything in Japan is just a little cuter than in any other country. So that's something that you might see pop up in the Hidden Lands. I also find it very fascinating how like the French have had a history of this very strong cultural identity that feels very refined, almost aggressive in its Frenchness. I've always been fascinated with the Palace of Versailles and all the like rules that they had in Versailles, and like the whole thing of like the rules for like what makes this cheese a particular French cheese. I like those cultures that have this really strong identity and like an almost obnoxious protectiveness over it. That isn't something I might necessarily want in my own country, but it's something I just find fascinating. So sometimes I grab things that I just really like. Sometimes I grab things that I just find really interesting. Just picking and choosing little bits that attract me so that my world ends up feeling like a very me sort of place. Tip number 5. If you can think of 2 places that are different but have one unifying attribute, that can be a good way to pull from 2 different places and create something unique without having to completely reinvent the wheel. Like my world has a version of Atlantis. When I think of Atlantis, you know, you're going to think of the Mediterranean. My Atlantis has a very strong merchant culture. So when I think of like the old Atlantis, I think of it as being kind of Venetian, like this Venetian merchant city. But as time passes on, some of the things that they were dealing in become illegal, and some of the families turn to organized crime instead of like legitimate wheeling and dealing. So then you start getting more inspiration from like The Godfather, Goodfellas, you know, mob movies, Italian mafia. There's a strong culture of family, honor, loyalty to the family. But one of the main characters in this world was inspired by a Chinese mafia character who appears in Grand Theft Auto, Wu Zimu.
The important thing to remember with a plan like this is that nothing can go wrong.
They also have a lot of that like family loyalty stuff going on. And when you think of like, you know, this glamorous Chinese port city, like old Shanghai or something, I also think once you bring in a few different things from our own world, it starts to evolve on its own and take on its own identity. But you do need to start somewhere. Like, it's hard to create a world where you're not drawing off of anything. My 6th tip: try to avoid basing your political conflicts and like your world leaders on any particular person or event in our world. Again, this is if you want the world to feel like its own place. You know, if you're making an alternate history fantasy, then that's the point of it. And there's nothing wrong with that. I enjoy those too. But if you want the world to feel like a unique place, I mean, this is true for anything I'm talking about in this video, but I do particularly want to call out the like world leaders and political conflicts, because I feel like a lot of people, like, maybe you don't know enough about political history, or you've only really explored like certain English kings. So you kind of see a lot of the same sort of figures pop up. It's usually based on certain famous kings and queens, or you get magical Hitlers. So here is my pitch for going a different direction with the leadership. I would think about what the peoples of my world really need and want, and what they would be drawn to based on the situation that they're in. Like my primary antagonists, who are the leaders of the Darmons, in a lot of ways, they give off kind of like a North Korea vibe. They have a lot of propaganda and they're kind of worshipped by the people. In this case, it's a fantasy world, and they did some crazy magical things that you can kind of understand why people have elevated them to the degree that they have. Like, they've earned that, but now they're going to keep working it as long as possible, keep this propaganda rolling. So as time marches onward and they are ruling for a very long time, it goes from like a legit hero to old leaders clinging to power based on past glory and just reminding everyone of their glorious things that they did in the past and exaggerating them in order to cling to power and keep this mythology going. Keep people worried that if they overthrow them, they're going to lose. these glory days. On the other hand, they have a real motive for their population to be very well educated and have a lot of scientific and magical advancements. So they really promote education. They really promote both magical and scientific study. And they have a very large region, so it's really hard for them to keep control of this propaganda when they also are getting an increasingly educated, spread out, diverse population. So thinking through those kind of needs, what does the population need and want in a leader, and how would the rise of a certain person affect things, can lead you to kind of create something unique. And along somewhat similar lines, my 7th and final tip, I think it's good to sit down and think of, like maybe 1 to 3 major aspects of this world that could only happen on a fantasy world, or also a science fiction world, because, you could also be working on that. Something that can't be replicated in our world, and then really think about the ramifications of that. It can be interesting to take a thing that is common in fantasy books, but just think it through in a really detailed or different way than any fantasy book has done before, or alternately to come up with something that's new to your world. In my world, the most obvious unique aspect is the existence of these doll people or created beings, how they're created, why they're created, how their role in the world develops over time, and the ramifications of creating people who don't have families but do have souls and minds, and who kind of operate differently from flesh and blood people. So I really like throwing in this one magical thing and then thinking like, what would happen if this magical thing really was true? How would that affect people? Because when you read about technological advancements, there's often an unexpected effect that wasn't what you planned when you invented the thing. You think you're just inventing X, but it ends up changing the world in all these different ways. And I think it's very fascinating when you can follow that thought process with magic as well. So those are all the tips I can think of on this topic. As with all my videos, I call them tips, but they're only advice if it resonates with you. I'm not trying to tell you like this is how to write a fantasy novel. In fact, I love all sorts of fantasy novels, from the standard medieval England setting to fantasy novels that draw from a very specific culture, very specific time and place, especially one that I've never seen before. That can be really fascinating, especially if an author from that background is drawing from very specific legends or lore or aspects of their home country or ancestral country. I love all of that. So the topic of this video is how to kind of pull from lots of different sources to make something that feels unique, but it is certainly not the only way to write an amazing fantasy novel. If you do have any thoughts about how to make a fantasy world that feels like its own unique place, I would love to hear any other tips. Maybe anything that you've tried or worked into your own fantasy world to give it its own unique feel, or any examples of stories that you love that did a great job of it. And directly after this premiere, I'm going to hop onto my Discord server, which is available with my $5 Patreon tier, every month after my world building video. I have a little scheduled chat and throw out some questions pertaining to the topic of this video, and then like whatever direction people want to go from there. I love it when it just evolves into an organic conversation. And we also just talk there casually all the time. I also have a regular Q&A post that is on Patreon and Substack and is available for free. And you can find my books in the description if you want to support my work and this channel. I think that's it for promoting myself, but I so appreciate you just for being here. I love having these conversations with you via my videos and the comments, just chatting it up on YouTube. It's always such a pleasure. And I'll see you next time. Bye.